Okay, so in class 5, we learned about negative numbers. And I've included a set of all of our rules here so that we can refer to them easily whenever we need them. And that's generally good practice whenever you're working with something new where you have to remember basic rules. It's a good idea to have them handy so you can refer to them while you're working. So in class, we learned that we are going to be thinking about positive numbers as piles of sand and negative numbers as holes. So one pile of sand is the opposite of a hole in the sand. Therefore, putting a pile of sand together with a hole in the sand adds up to 0. And we also learned that instead of thinking about addition, instead of thinking about adding and subtracting, we are instead going to think about just adding, but we're going to be thinking about and talking about adding positive, and negative numbers. Oops, pen is a little funny today. Positive and negative numbers. So let's start with one of the questions on the homework assignment. And also I want to add that another thing that we learned is that instead of considering this sign to mean minus, we're going to think of it in terms of meaning the opposite of the number that it is in front of. So, for example, the opposite of a pile of sand is a hole in the sand. So if we're going to use 1 to represent one pile in the sand, negative 1 is going to represent one hole in the sand. Okay, so let's move on to our question here, now that we've established some ground rules. Okay, so here we go. We have quite a bit to work with here. And the first thing that we're going to start with is focusing on the insides of the brackets as much as we can. So let's go through here and see what the first operations are that we can work on. Let's take a look. So we know that first we need to focus on the insides of brackets. That's what comes first. And then we also know that we need to look at multiplication before we look at addition. So let's look at all the insides of our brackets. Well, we have negative 16 here. It's on its own. Okay, so we'll let that sit for a second. We've got a negative 3 here. And then we have this these other operations inside brackets. We've got 2 minus 7 times the negative 3. So we know that we have to operate on the 7 times negative 3 before we subtract that from 2. So let's start with that and see what we get to for the next line. So I'm just going to rewrite everything at this point until I get to the part that I'm going to be solving. 2 minus, okay, so 7 times negative 3, that is negative 21. And if you need a refresher, I'm just going to write it on the side here. So a negative times positive, oops, that's supposed to be a positive, is a negative, and negative times a negative becomes a positive, And there's a really good explanation of why that's true in your class notes, so you should take a look at that if you want proof of why that makes sense. And I would absolutely encourage you to fully understand why that works. Okay, so we're going to continue here. So now I've gotten to negative 21. Okay, so I still have to close this bracket here. And then what's left? I have times negative 16, and I'm closing those brackets. Okay, let's continue. What are the next things that I want to work on? Let me change the color of my pen again so we can note that down. Okay, so what do I have inside brackets that I want to focus on? All right, here I've got 2 minus negative 21. So we're not going to be focusing on subtracting here. Instead, we are going to be thinking of this in terms of adding negative numbers. So instead of saying 2 minus negative 21, I'm going to be thinking of this in terms of 2 plus the opposite of negative 21. And what do we know is the opposite of a negative? Well, it's a positive. So I'm going to cross out both of those negative signs, and then I just have 2 plus 21. So let's rewrite this. 0, I'm just going to erase this so that I have a little bit more room. Okay, so 0 times 456 minus, so what's inside here now? 2 plus 21. 2 plus 21 is 23. I'm going to close that bracket. I got rid of the one on the inside, and I'm multiplying this by negative 16. Close that bracket and close that bracket. Okay, so now if you take a look at this, I have these 2 big brackets that all this stuff is on the inside of. So I want to work on the stuff that's in here before I multiply everything by this 0 out here. Okay, so what am I going to do first? I have 456 minus, or rather plus, negative 23 times negative 16. So I know that I have to do the multiplication first. So 0 times 456 minus, and let's find out what that comes to. 23 times negative 16 is going to be a negative number, and that is going to be negative 368. Okay, so we're getting very close. Let's repeat. So 0 times 456, and once again, I'm not thinking in terms of subtraction. I'm going to be adding the opposite of negative 368. And what do I know is the opposite of a negative? The opposite of a whole is a pile, so those will cancel out. And now I'm just going to be adding 456 to 368. Let's rewrite that one more time. 0 times those two numbers added together, which is 824. Okay, last but not least, we are multiplying 0 times 824. And if you need a reminder, you can look at our rules. Rule number 4 says 0 times any number a is equal to 0. Therefore, our 824 is doomed, the answer is 0. So technically, we could have known that if we know that 0 times anything is 0, and we knew that we were multiplying this entire equation by 0, because we had these big brackets surrounding the whole thing, we could have figured out immediately that the answer was going to be 0.